Welcome to the Genesis Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Sean. Along with me is Pastor Ryan. Join us this year as we study the book of Genesis and go through our brand new series, Foundations, where we'll see God's design for everything, where it's gone wrong, and how his plan of redemption has been seen from the beginning. Now, let's join the conversation. Welcome to the Genesis Podcast. Fall is officially here, and if you hear a little raspiness in my voice, that is only because it's true. I may have a slight cold, but I'm doing better.
Me too, actually.
Do you really?
I don't think I have a cold, but we've got some less than favorable diseases roaming around our office. People getting sore throats.
Dude, it'd be going around.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like the clouds are overhead, like you're wearing a sweatshirt.
It was raining really hard today.
It's like, it's dark when I wake up. So
It's cold in the morning, which I like.
yeah, we've been sleeping with our window open. And last night was finally to the point I'm like, ooh, it's a little too cold. We can't be doing that. So
Seasons be a-changing.
We're in it. So today we're talking about Jacob. And we were just talking about before we pressed record how it's interesting. When you think of Genesis, it's easy for people to rattle off some main characters, and one of them being Abraham.
Yep.
And Abraham takes up a really good portion of the book. But in fact, after doing a little bit of math, we discovered Jacob's life, as far as how many chapters has in Genesis, it's more than Abraham's life. And so we're entering a section into our study in Genesis where we're getting pretty into the problems, the life. You kind of use the analogy of the soap opera, the days of our lives. But the main theme here is story. And there's a story that we're all invited into that brings us meaning. And on the other side of that, we have the temptation to try to create our own story. And when we do that, just like in Jacob's story, we run into problems, right? And so I think it'd be fun to start off by give us kind of an outline of the sermons over the last few weeks. Although there's a beautiful gospel ending to all of it, because that's the way we see to the cross. There's some real tangible issues going on with the life of Jacob. And so maybe you can kind of like start from the last 3 weeks and just let's kind of work through what are some issues that we're seeing here.
Yeah. So just to back on that, the Abraham story is Genesis 12 through 25. The Jacob story is Genesis 25 through 50. So it's twice the amount of chapters. I think it's interesting. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but also the nation of Israel is given her name based on Jacob.
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting. Like, he's the third patriarch in the line there, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. But he's the one whose name is changed to Israel, which means prevailed or wrestled with God. And we'll talk about that story next in our next podcast and next sermon. But Jacob, in this section of sermons we've taught through, in this portion of Genesis we're working through, Jacob, this is after, of course, the last recording where he has an encounter with Yahweh through a dream at Bethel, and there's a stairway from heaven with angels ascending and descending, and he realizes it's a holy place. As he's on the run, he realizes God's running after him, which is a beautiful image, of course, of the gospel and fulfilled in Christ. But he eventually makes his way to Padan Aram. He actually gets to his mother's side of the family and her kinsmen, all those friends and relatives. And as he gets there, he asks those locals where he is and if they knew of Laban. And they say, well, yeah, we know him. Like, these are his flocks. And here comes his daughter, Rachel. And then, of course, he's smitten. So, like, the story here is Jacob's a single man. Jacob wants to find a wife. In fact, that's part of what his parents sent him to her side of the family to go find. Also, an ulterior motive to get away from Esau, because Esau wanted to kill him. And they had a lot of family drama. So as he's on his way, he got sent off to college, quote unquote. And God's kind of like running him down, quote unquote, but he's not quite getting the full message. And he runs into a situation where he meets a girl, meets a significant other, and falls in love with her and wants to marry her.
So pause. What I just heard you say. So in one section, Jacob's running from something.
Yeah.
But he's also running to something.
Yeah, he's not. He knows where he's trying to get to Padan Aram. He's trying to get to Laban, his mother's brother. And from there, his parents want him to select a wife.
Yeah.
So when he gets there, he's running to that. He sees Rachel. She's a shepherdess, so she just must be awesome. She's catches his eye. He's very attracted to her. He has this superhuman feat of strength where he pulls off the top of a well, like the cover of a well himself, which normally would take multiple people to do. And it's like a kind of funny little note. It's like him showing off to Rachel, like,
Yeah.
you know, I do CrossFit or whatever. It's how I do with Annie because I do
Yeah.
a lot of CrossFit.
Yeah. So this is like for those of us who went to college, this probably reminds us of like the
Oh my
first week of
gosh.
school. Mom calls and is like, so how's
peacocking.
things going? You're like, really good.
Yeah, there's a lot of peacocking going on. Everyone's trying to, yeah, not necessarily, but she's a shepherdess, and so he falls in love with her right there. But she then goes back to Laban and says, "Hey, like our relatives here," and then Laban comes out and like they greet, and he's like, "Oh man," and he's like, "Come work for me, but don't work for me for free because you're not a slave, you're a family. What do you want for wages?" And this is where really the beginning of the story that we've been in the last 3 weeks takes shape, which is Laban putting on a front that he's for Jacob. But Jacob experiencing the actuality that Laban's for himself.
Wow.
So he says, I don't want to treat you like a slave, so tell me your wages. You know, Pastor Justin just preached this last Sunday, and it's in the section of Genesis, I think it's 31, chapter 30, 31, where Jacob expresses that Laban has dealt with him unjustly and changed his wages 10 times. Well, here's one of the examples. I'll work 7 years for your daughter, Rachel. Well, he does. And it seemed like the text, right? So I called it the soap opera, The Days of Our Lives, because it's so romantic. And it only seemed like a few days to Jacob to work for 7 years for the dowry for Rachel. But then Laban tricks him and gives him Leah.
Yeah.
And, you know, some of the questions people might have, like, which is the point of this podcast, is like, how is that even possible? How
Yeah,
is it possible?
I'm wondering that.
How is it possible to work 7 years for this woman that you definitely would know what she looks like and, you know, whatever else
Smells like.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden that night you don't know. And I think, again, I mentioned it in the sermon, but like, I think there's just a couple reasons there. One of them is the usage of a veil in this culture. And so if you think about Middle Eastern culture, even today, whether that's represented by like Islam, like that particular religion and worldview and culture, women, what do you see?
Eyes.
Yeah. Like a lot of it's covered. So there's a veil component. It's also why I think there's reference to Leah's eyes were soft, which we can talk about that. We probably should. I didn't bring that up in the sermon. We can talk about it here. But essentially what happens there is, I think he has to get really drunk though. And it's not the first time we would see in stories of Genesis of people getting irresponsibly drunk. Like Lot did it. Noah did it. Like Abraham didn't do it. And that's encouraging. But like there's plenty of characters who got pretty drunk. So I think he had to have been pretty drunk. And the combination of that plus not fully seeing the face of Leah and then being, you know, ready to consummate marriage after that sexual consummation act in that time in particular, it's like they're married. There's no like,
That was the seal.
yeah, there's no like, let's go back and, you know, so he wakes up the next morning, somewhat sobered up, probably hungover, realizes, oh my gosh, I slept with Leah.
Wow.
And if he slept with Leah, it's an irreversible act. So sexual consummation was the seal, the finality of that marital covenant.
And it is still now.
Should be.
Yeah.
Should be.
Should be.
It's not actually in our culture. It's not in our culture. It's there's a reason why I think that ancient culture thought of it that way. And I think that there's some really important principles to borrow from that, which is to understand that sex is not just physical. It's not just what we do with our bodies, but it somehow connects to something deeper in us. And that the only vehicle, the only container, if you will, that's sufficiently capable of carrying the intensity, the soul binding reality, the procreative potentiality of sexual intercourse is marriage. Because it can produce children, and children need a sturdy covenantal framework of mother and father to be raised in. And so like, but in our culture, it's actually not the sex consummation act. It's a wedding license, or maybe a ceremony in our culture, if at best.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Paper or party.
Yep. Paper or party. And the whole other element is a part of that, obviously, but the statistics are pretty overwhelming. The amount of people who are saving themselves and their sexual union for marriage. Anyway, maybe I digress, but that's the point of the podcast. So he wakes up realizing it's Leah and he's got a complaint. So here's my point. He's dealing with this whole part of the story is Jacob dealing with the taste of his own medicine. Jacob is now on the receiving end of deception. Before this, Jacob's been on the dealing end of deception. He's tricked his brother. He's tricked his father, right? For a birthright and a blessing.
Mm-hmm.
Now he's on the receiving end, not the dealing end of deception. And it stinks. So, I mean, the phrase, what goes around comes around. What you reap, you've already sown.
Yeah.
And he's facing some of that. So he's very mad. And of course he says, I want Rachel. And Laban says, well, in our custom, I couldn't possibly, this is his deceptive move, couldn't possibly marry off the older sister before the younger. Trying to protect the fact that what he actually wanted
7 years
was
ago.
7 more years of free labor.
Yeah.
Is exploitative. Full stop.
Huh. So at the beginning of those 7 years, though, I mean, that was all set up that he would get Leah's hand in marriage.
No, Rachel's.
Rachel's hand in marriage.
Yes. So the way I interpret the text, and there's some debate on it, is he then complains to Laban and says, I worked for Rachel, not Leah. And Laban, I think, lies, even if it's culturally true. Well, I couldn't have given Leah away. You're right. Your point is, well, then why in the world would they have worked for an arrangement 7 years prior? This is becoming just a cheap excuse, a cheap alibi from Laban. And then he says, finish the week. I think it's a marital week because it seems to me in the text that Rachel is then given to him as the second wife and he still works 7 years. So some people think he worked 7 more years and never consummated marriage with Rachel. I don't think that. I think that he waited a week and then married Rachel. And then Leah and Rachel, their saga happens while he's working 7 more years.
7 more.
Some don't. It's just how you interpret the word week. And is that week indicative of the 7 more years, or is it like a marriage week? So when you get into the text there specifically, it seems to me more likely that it's saying, okay, I'll give you Rachel now. This is going to sound terrible, but it's kind of like it's like it's like a payoff program. Like, here's the house, but there's a mortgage.
Yeah.
So here's
Rent to
Rachel.
own.
Yeah, it's a rent to own situation. Here's Rachel, but you got to work 7 years, but you can have her now.
From a numbers standpoint, is there anything significant about it being 7 years?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't know of that. I mean, obviously 7 is a significant number in the Bible, but I don't know of that holding any particular weight. Other than a time of agreement, that was a significant number. It signified completion. Maybe that's why they chose it. It seemed like I don't know, but I don't think so. Or not that I'm aware of. I'm not like privy to that. So anyway, then what happens is in the story, so he's deceived by Laban, and now he starts to get deceived by his wives. To some degree, or at least manipulated. So has great disdain for Leah because she was, the fruit of deception. But God sees that. He sees that Leah's hated and afflicted and mistreated. And so God opens Leah's womb. So Leah starts having sons first. So, which the sons were, an absolute esteem in this culture because of carrying on your lineage and building your family name and your family, power and dynamics and all that. So Leah starts having kids, and then her and Rachel start having tension. They're obviously sisters, which is complicated. And I mentioned this, Leviticus, Moses, who writes this and gives us the order of God's law and instruction for Israel later, talks about, no, do not have sisters as wives. So again, God is not for polygamy, but in God's permissive, Israel is doing all sorts of things God didn't design them to do. God is trying to hem in the foolishness, the craziness. And so they start fighting. Rachel gets mad at Jacob, give me another kid, or give me children or I'll die. And then Jacob's like, how do I control this? And then so she's like, well, then I'll control it. Take my servant. I think it was Bilhah. And so then they have a couple of kids. Jacob does with Bilhah, and that somehow like assuages Rachel's sense of unworth, but doesn't last very long because then Leah sees that as rivalry, so she gives, I think it's Zilpah, don't know which one's who, but to Jacob, and then there's a few more that are born, and then Reuben, the firstborn of Leah and Jacob's out in the field and finds some mandrakes, and then Rachel finds out about that and wants those because those are an ancient aphrodisiac, basically a fertility aid myth. And so she barters with Leah. And so Leah, who's not been, it appears, very intimate with Jacob because he doesn't love her and he already got sons from her, now utilizes her trait of those mandrakes to say, you have to sleep with me some more. And they have some more kids. And every time they each have kids, and I mentioned this when I preached through it, they tell themselves a story. They have some refrain that they echo in the naming of the child that is their belief about themselves and the child. And the reason why naming is really important in Hebrew culture, and it's significant, and God changes names when it marks a significant time in someone's identity and purpose and all that. We'll see that with Jacob here this next week. We saw it with Abram becoming Abraham, the father of many nations. And we'll see it here, Jacob becoming Israel, one who wrestles or contends with God compared to one who supplants and deceives. But just because that's true doesn't mean that the things they're telling themselves God's signing off on. And if you look at it, she's saying all sorts of crazy stuff, Leah and Rachel, but mostly Leah. Like, if I just have another kid, my husband will love me. If I just have another kid, he'll respect me. He'll honor me. Like, she's telling herself a story to try to find meaning, value, and worth. And that's what we do. We do the same thing. So God's got this great story he's writing in the, big frame. And then we've got this little story we're living. Like our, family life growing up, and then our heading out in the world, and us finding a job and finding a spouse and trying to make things happen, and us having to taste the fruit of our own stupidity when we were picking on our siblings or being a pain in the butt for our parents. All of a sudden we get out in the world and experience other people who are treating us that way. And there's all this tension related to that. And it's like life lessons and challenges. And it feels like a soap opera.
Yeah.
It's drama. It's relational, and it's familial, and it's financial, and it's emotional. And so we spin a story for ourselves to try to cope in this broken world.
Yeah.
And they're trying to spin the story. And my point from this section of scripture to our church is be careful the sermons you're preaching to yourself because they're powerful. You're starting to frame your world. And we need God's wisdom and God's truth to help reframe our world in light of his story. And prayer was my point. Prayer is actually the greatest gift and proving ground or fighting ground of us wrestling with the accuracy of our stories. That's why prayer matters.
Yeah.
Prayer matters not because God's like an eternal casino vending machine and like we just kind of like, pull down and hope we get something good. Prayer matters because it's the arena in which we take our stories and we offer them up to God's story. And in that collision, our story is shaped, reframed, and refined.
Yeah.
And that's what I think I see in this section of Jacob's life. This is happening through pain. It's happening through pain, through tension with his wives, with his family, with his children, with his father-in-law, with his finances. He's experiencing a lot of tension. And I think what God is offering all of us is, even in the midst of our lives and all of their tension, we can either fight over that and tell ourselves our own story, or we can submit our stories to God's bigger story and find joyful meaning in that. So that's kind of how I would wrap up and kind of explain that section. I want to leap back to the one thing about Leah's eyes. So one of the challenging things about the text is the text says that Jacob loved Rachel and thought her to be beautiful in form and appearance. It's literally what it says. So Jacob is attracted to the physical form of Rachel. I don't know. You can just, whatever. Her hair, her legs, her body, her face, her eyes, I don't know. Her body, her presentation. And that's contrasted with Leah. And it says Leah had dull eyes. And so there's all this debate on what this means. And we don't.
Dull or soft?
Well, let's look at the translation here. So let me actually type this in. This will help. Genesis. I think this is 29 is my guess. 28. Yeah, it's 29 is what I thought. Yeah. So here's this right here. 29:15. Laban says to Jacob, "You are my kinsman, my fellow relative. Should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be." Laban now had 2 daughters. The name of the oldest daughter was Leah, and the name of the youngest was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak. The word weak there can also be translated soft or dull. Rachel, however, was beautiful in form and appearance. So here's the debate. The debate is this saying that Leah couldn't see well? Her eyes were weak. She didn't have very good vision. Is this saying she had soft eyes, and that maybe is another word to interpret instead of weak, and it means that her eyes, which would be a dominant feature in this culture because of the veil, were soft. They were gentle. So you could take a positive interpretation of this, and some have, instead of it feeling like it's rude to Leah. Like Leah's eyes were soft. They were gentle. They were kind. Okay? The reason why I don't hold that view is because the author then contrasts the weak eyes of Leah with the beautiful form and appearance of Rachel. So if we were trying to underscore a different but albeit positive quality of Leah's physicality, I don't know why you would move to compare Rachel's...
A positive and a positive.
Yes, you wouldn't move to a positive, beautiful form and appearance if you're not trying to make a contrasting negative.
Totally.
And I think it's uncomfortable here. Obviously, it's like, are we serious? Like the Bible is literally... But again, I'd remind everyone what the Bible describes and says is oftentimes the harsh, brute reality of how things were going, not what God thought. God wasn't like, yeah, Leah's less attractive, Rachel's more attractive. What the Bible is telling us through its inspired record is that's what Jacob thought, which would explain why Jacob disdained her. He did not find her attractive.
Yeah.
And yet he found himself married to her. So I think that's how I would interpret that. But again, Leah's eyes were weak is a confusing way to say it. So any questions on that?
Well, I want to draw down actually on Leah, because this is a fascinating part of the story that maybe I haven't thought of. And it's, we all have past, we all have baggage. And so Jacob comes into this story with some past that we've already talked about, a deceptive past. And so he's running away from a rhythm of life that he's like, hopefully I can get away from this and a better start from here. Now he works 7 years, and I would say anybody who's listening to this, like 7 years is a good chunk of time. We'd agree on that. And when he gets Leah and he thought he was getting Rachel, I think probably most people would be like, wow, dang, if I was Jacob, I would also be kind of disappointed. I'd be like, I just got defrauded. Like, this isn't even right. Now, what's interesting here, and what I heard you say, is that Leah, in some senses, God saw her in probably what was sorrow and mourning, because what was a hope for a husband who would take care of her heart and love her turned into almost the exact opposite, but she was locked in on it. Like, it's not like she could divorce Jacob.
Totally.
Right? And she had another option. And so
I feel the most bad for Leah.
yeah. And so where my heart kind of went was actually to Matthew 5 and verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And why that stands out to me is it seems as if, despite the fact that yes, Jacob was wronged, Laban was being deceitful, God is actually looking at how we respond even to perceived injustices to us. And I think if we are sitting here with Jacob, he was probably living in a way that felt like all the reasons he was treating Leah were justified. Do you see that probably similarly?
Yeah, probably. I don't think there's any indication in the text that says he wasn't. It seems like she gets mistreated, afflicted. She calls her marriage a hated, afflicted reality in her life. And yeah, probably.
So
It's where we're grasping. We don't know the details, but like it seems that way.
yeah. So now we're sitting here in 2023, and I mean, I feel like that is the word of the millennial generation is fair. Is like, are things fair? And it's interesting to see how people respond to it in the Old Testament of how they handled fairness. And here you just see a woman who, I mean, we don't know much about her, but in a way I admire in a weird aspect, because she's committing to what she's been given. Like, she's not looking for an escape. What do you think this teaches us about the theme of how do we deal with unfairness in our own lives and respond to it?
I don't think life is fair, first of all. And I don't think that fair is the same meaning as just. Though this is not just. I think this has elements of unjust for sure. I think what it also illustrates is if we don't find a way to reckon with unfair pain and suffering in life, we will pass it on. What you do not let transform you, you will just transfer.
Wow.
So think about that. Like, in other words, and I'm giving away my sermon this next week, but so be it. Jacob doesn't really have his transformational experience until he wrestles with God. And so his deceptive ways were something he was comfortable dealing, but something he did not enjoy receiving. And instead of dealing with that in a way that would be to come to God and allow pain and even things that are unfair or unjust to like work out and heal in us, which is hard, then he just is passing it on. So he feels justified in shunning and afflicting and ignoring and being a terrible husband to Leah. And now Leah has a new wound, which is, why did my dad give me to this man? And why does this man not love me, even though I've given him 4 sons? And then she, instead of dealing with that unfairness, she just moves to bitter rivalry to her sister. So you can either let unfairness transform you, or you can just transfer it and kick it down the can to the next most important person in your life. That's why marriage is such a powerful thing, because it is a container that's not only powerful enough to handle the explosive beauty, wonder, and mystery of sex, it's also a container that, if we think about it from a redeemed lens, like the Apostle Paul taught us to in Ephesians 5, we'll see it as one of the greatest relationships we have that can actually heal us, transform us.
Wow.
It can become, as we talked about a few weeks ago in the podcast, the difference between a transactional relationship format and a transformational one. And so I guess I am kind of picking up that same theme now that I think back to that podcast. It's these individuals aren't allowing, because they don't. It's also very apparent they don't have a very robust relationship with Yahweh. They don't. It's in its infancy stage for Jacob, and I don't even know how much it's owned or shared by Leah and Rachel. Because we see in what we just saw last week in Genesis, Leah like steals her dad's household gods when they're on the run to head back to Canaan. And as Justin pointed out, that did have some family contractual land estate connection points to it. But it also illustrates, you'll see it later when Jacob finally does wrestle with God. He tells his family, put away your household gods, bury them and get rid of them. We're going to go move to Bethel and worship Yahweh. Like, they are, and Israel had this problem throughout her history of like constantly falling prey to Baal and to the Asherah poles and to Molech and all these false gods around them. They would commingle. They would, build their little syncretized faith that was like Yahweh plus a bunch of other gods. And it was always a mess for them. So I don't think Leah and Rachel in particular have a large apparatus to draw from. I don't think their husband's leading them super well. He's had a smattering of encounters with Yahweh, one of them in a dream at Bethel. He knows his mother and father worshiped Yahweh and had encounters with him. And there's a promise there from Abraham to Isaac and now that blessing's falling to him in some way. But I'm not sure at this point in the story how much that's really sunk in for him. So again, yeah, my take would just be life is unfair. You can't go through life with eventually not having a gripe that someone did something or allowed something, or even God didn't intervene or allowed something to happen in your life that just is not fair. By every conceivable look at it, it just doesn't seem fair. What I would say is God invites us to bring that lament, that complaint, that wound into a trusted space with him and allow him to heal us. And if we don't feel we've had the answers we crave, we at least we'll definitely have his presence, which will satisfy us in a different way.
As a guy who I know you've done lots of premarital counseling, you're probably thinking, man, if I was doing premarital for like Leah and Jacob, I probably would have, had X, Y, and Z conversations with them and diagnosed it as, well, you didn't get to do that. However,
Yeah.
we're here. Do you think, or not even do you think, like, how much do you think having two wives impacted one of those relationships actually to be transformative?
Oh, immensely. And that was the whole point of my sermon. And I made it not the whole point. I made it really, 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 really clear. I think you were out of town, so you might not have heard that sermon, but I heard it made it really clear. This whole thing is proof polygamy is a terrible idea. Because there's no way to have polygamy and not have rivalry. There's no way to have multiple wives, or I think it's called polyandry, multiple husbands. Or now we have polyamorous, which is multiple husbands and wives, in our absolutely stupid and confused state of ever-increasing self-definition and lustful pursuit. Like, it's a disaster. It's an unmitigated disaster. And there's not one example I can think of in the Bible where the presence of polygamy did not pollute an entire family line. Let's think about it this way. David, even the great David, had some of this in his life. And his son, even worse, Solomon, like what, 1,000 concubines and wives? And the line of David and his sons and their sons is fraught with mutiny, backstabbing, and violence.
Wow.
In fact, even Jacob's kids, he had 12 sons, 13 listed because Dinah was the one daughter. And he had those children with four different different wives, Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah. And what happens in chapter 37 of Genesis? We're literally 6 chapters away. We'll be there in 3 weeks. I'll tell you what happens. Reuben, the oldest, Simon, the next oldest, they all get frustrated because Joseph, the second youngest, starts popping off about dreams he's having and how much, dad just loves him because Rachel died when she delivered Benjamin, the youngest. And Joseph and Benjamin are the only 2 sons from his loved wife, Rachel, and she's gone. So he overfavors them, and his other brothers are jealous. And think about all because look at Reuben's mom is Leah. Joseph's mom is Rachel. They don't even have the same moms.
Yeah.
So because they don't even have the same moms, they have the same dad, they don't have the same moms, they're rivalrous. They're jealous of each other. They're jockeying for significance and position and cohesion, and it's challenging. Now, on a positive note, because we live in a fractured world, if we come from mixed families and that's part of a lot of our stories, people in our church, there's a way through. It's like part times you read the Bible and you go, well, if they were that jacked up, there's hope for me. Good. That's a good takeaway. But the other takeaway needs to be, see that when you don't do things God's way, you create hurdles and consequences and confusion and wounds. So anyway, here's your proof of the generational after effects of polygamy. You end up wanting to kill your sibling. And they're ready to do it.
Yeah.
And then they throw him in a pit. And then Reuben, I think it's Reuben, if I remember right, is able to talk them out of it. And they see a band of travelers coming, and they're headed to Egypt to sell spices. And they say, let's sell them into slavery. So they do. And then they tear up his robe and they fill it with blood, and they basically go back and tell their dad that he was attacked by a beast and torn to pieces, and he's gone. And then they send their dad into a Great Depression.
Yeah.
Like, well, there's your proof. There's your proof. So no, I mean, I want to be careful. Like these people, for Leah and for Rachel and for Bilhah and Zilpah and Jacob and their kids, I mean, the deck is so stacked against you, and trying to transform your pain into healing and like something beautiful, because you got a lot of things that you got to work through.
Yeah.
And they're not set up to do it very well because they're already adrift from God's plan.
Yeah. Within the first few chapters of Genesis, we see marriage introduced as a cornerstone piece of how God
Civilization. Yeah.
just how God plans to organize.
Yep.
Now here in this section, we see how when we augment or change even just a small piece of what God's covenant blessing is, it can quickly turn into like curse and blunder. And I mean, that is like so true of today's cultural moment. Like we're trying to change. Well, I won't get into the whole list, but we're trying to change a lot in today's modern world. And I'm just curious, like what a testament of God's sovereignty that even when we try to change His promises, He still comes through, right? Because Jacob, I mean, at this point, had we witnessed polygamy? So
Lamech was the first polygamist in the Bible. Genesis 4. I think it's the descendants of Cain. Yeah. You have Genesis 1, God creating everything. Genesis 2, God creating the first, married covenantal couple, Adam and Eve, just their story and their union. Then they have Cain and they have Abel. And then they sin, they fall into sin. Then after that, Cain kills Abel. And then Cain gets banished from Eden, or they're already banished from Eden from the prior action, but further banished from his people, further put a mark on him. And then I think it's 7 generations from Cain is Lamech, and he's the first one to take 2 wives. And he says, if Cain has killed one, I'm killing more. Like he just gets more violent, more destructive. So yeah, the first written example of polygamy we have in the Bible is Lamech, and he's terrible. It's a total woeful like warning. And then you have, the whole story continuing. But Abraham ends up there because of the unbelief and fear of his wife, and him's complicit and saying, yeah, give me your servant as my wife. And it was very culturally common, right? So the cultural common thing seeps into the followers of Yahweh because they were, forgetful of his ways and his design, which is a total warning to us for sure. But yeah, I mean, there's just no way to say polygamy is God's plan, even though it's undeniably present in the Old Testament. It's there because it's culture, but it'd be like today saying whether it's greed or it's sexual promiscuity or it's addiction or whatever, like it's present. Yeah. It's in all sorts of expressions of people that claim to love God, people that do love God. Like this is still present. It's not God's plan or his design or his hope for his people. So that just has to be clear. But yeah, it's definitely polygamy we're getting a great test case for like how bad it works, especially in the scenario which this is the most common historical scenario of many women, one man. And there's biological reasons for that if you think about it. Like a man can impregnate a bunch of women, but if there was one woman and a bunch of men,
right,
like from just a population control
time horizon,
it's a lot less functional, but it's something that people would think is pretty functional because you can have way more kids way faster. So in the time of civilization building and population building, it would make sense. There'd be some elements of it that are pragmatic, but it's not God's design because it wreaks significant havoc on the soul, on the heart, and on relationships. And it's not the picture that God is, drawn up for how that family unit should operate. Anyway, so then the story continues essentially after they have all these kids with Jacob growing in wealth. So they have all these kids, but then he grows in wealth. Like his flocks grow, they increase. And then he gets this inclination he wants to leave. He's been there now for close to 20 years. And he's like, I think, maybe it's 15. He ends up being there 20 years total. But he's like, I think I'm ready to go home. And then Laban comes to him again and just says, hey, I learned by divination that I'm blessed because of you. Divination, and for those that would wonder what the heck is that, divination would be basically, think of like pagan inquiry or inquiry into oracles. So pagans practice this. They would use maybe like the entrails of animals, and they would go see some sort of priest or priestess over like pagan ritual or belief, and that pagan ritual or priestess or priest would commit to tell you your future or what's next. And you see this in pagan nations, and so obviously Laban has done some sort of
is this like witchcraft?
some sort of like consulting of witchcraft or divination or evil, and through that has come to realize that like the spiritual blessing, this is like demonic.
Yeah.
Basically saying, I engaged in demonic inquiry. Yeah. And discovered, because demons and the whole spiritual realm could see or understand at least, well, part of the reason Jacob's so blessed is Yahweh's eye is on him. So he comes to Jacob and says, I learned through divination that like I'm blessed because of you. Don't leave. What do you want for your wages? Name them. So they have another wage conversation. Jacob is very leery now, having been burned by this guy. And he basically says, okay, fine. I don't want to take advantage of you anyway. And I don't want you to be able to accuse me of taking advantage of you in any way. I'll tend your flocks, but the flocks that I will tend of your sheep are the spotted, mottled, and muddled, sheep. And the ones that are without spot or blemish, you can have. And then that'll be my portion. And I'll continue to oversee all this because he was a skilled herdsman, shepherd. And so he does. Now, Laban immediately moves to deceive him because that's who he is. He basically he leaves that conversation when they agree, and he separates the spotted, mottled, and striped flock from the without blemish and separates them and gives the without blemish ones to his kids, I think, to his sons, and basically trying to say, you're going to just get weaker and weaker and weaker, and I'm going to get stronger and stronger and stronger, and I'm going to separate our flocks in order to do it, and that's going to be great. Well, we learn a chapter ahead of where that text takes place, that God speaks to Jacob in a dream and says, I see this, and I need you to know, like, I'm going to provide for you and protect you. So God, though Jacob does use a like folk customary approach of these sticks and making the animals, when they'd come to feed or come to drink, and they would mate, to line up in what they would look like. So if you see these sticks that are stripped, the spotted and the striped and whatever, they would go there because it's what they would see, and then they would mate there. And as they would do that, it would increase those kinds. And Laban even tries to change it and shift it, and he just keeps changing it as well. And God, of course, is superintending this. It's a mystery to me. It's a very tough text to understand as far as wait a second, Jacob's doing stuff that's like folk custom, or just kind of this is what, think of it if you were to go talk to somebody who's like a farmer, like Farmer's Almanac, or they're like, well, we do this all the time. So here's the wisdom we know. You want to get a calf like that, you do this when whatever that is.
He's just, if I understand correctly, he was organizing based on strong characteristics, and they were trying to breed for either more healthy flocks.
Yep. And the way it ended up working out was because he set up these physical emblems of the characteristics that they were going to exhibit on their coat. Miraculously, God superintended that so that Jacob ended up getting exactly the wages Laban was saying he would not take.
Oh.
Yes. That's the kind of supernatural part of it.
Yeah, so the supernatural part is that what actually, from a biological standpoint, between these animals took place, God intervened and made it in Jacob's benefit.
Because Laban kept changing it, and every time it just kept working in the favor. It's like throwing a dice, and every time the guy says, the winning number's 3. Okay, next week, the winning number's 5. The winning number's 1. The winning number's 4. And every time Jacob throws the dice, i.e. the animal's mate, it just keeps coming up on the number for Jacob and not Laban. So he just keeps getting more and more and more and more flock.
That is so wild. So Laban, by divination, catches wind of the blessing. He wants the benefit of Jacob's blessing. And then he thinks he can somehow twist the cards.
Yes.
To then get, wow.
And God basically goes, no dice. Yeah, and in that sense vindicates Jacob. So then the story kind of ends with essentially Jacob becoming extremely wealthy. Just like he's just got a lot more flocks. And according to the deal we set up. So
And
now,
he knows it.
Yeah. And now his sons, Laban's sons, see it. And they're like insecure. Jacob's starting to discern, like I'm just winning every bet we make. I better get the heck out of here. So he mentions that to his wives, and they're like, yep, our dad's a tool. We don't like him. He's squandered our wealth. Like, let's get out of here. Do whatever your God tells you to do. Indication they don't quite have the connection yet. And so he's like, all right, we're gonna go. So he moves his family stuff to the edge of the the grouping of all this wealth and herd and people and servants, and then boom, they like hightail it, split.
So he has this dream, and God speaks to him, and then on top of that, he experiences all this blessing. But it kind of made it sound like he still made a decision because of fear of man.
Who?
Jacob.
Yeah.
That he was going to split town and leave.
Yep.
So I mean, that's very relatable. I mean, as far as us experiencing blessing and good things, and then we wake up tomorrow morning like, oh, I'm stressed out again. I have an anxious presence about X, Y, Z.
Yep. Basically, they do that, and they're getting ready to go. And here's I'm reading it here. So what ends up happening is Jacob tells Leah and Rachel, like, get your stuff. We're getting out of here. And Rachel, basically, where's it at right here? I'm going to find it. Jacob.
They hop in the minivan.
Yeah, so Rachel ends up taking the household gods. Justin talked about this in his sermon, that part of this was her relying on her own wisdom, that if somehow Jacob were to die, who would take care of her? And then if she has these gods, they represent an element of attachment to her previous estate.
So she's figuring out her life insurance.
She is. She's making her plan. She had taken the household gods. She had stolen them. Rachel just says Rachel stole the household gods. So Laban then comes and overtakes them, and he's mad. And Jacob's like, what are you mad for? And he's like, you stole stuff. Jacob's like, we didn't steal nothing, because he doesn't know. Jacob doesn't know Rachel did this. So Jacob's talking all big. Then search my stuff. So Laban's like, okay. He searched for all stuff. Finally goes into where Rachel's at. And she has it. She has the household gods. And she basically takes them, and they're in like a camel's knapsack, and she sits on them. And then he checks everywhere in the tent, and she says to her dad, do not bring anger with me, my lord. I would rise, but I cannot, for the way of the woman is upon me. She basically says, I'm having my menstruation cycle right now, and that's why I'm not leaving, and you can understand that. So he's like, okay. She basically tricks her dad.
Wow.
Now Jacob then is ticked, because when Laban comes out and can't find the household gods, and it's like, what is my offense? Why have you hotly pursued me? Why have you run after me? We had a deal. We made a deal. God looked after me, and I got all the animals. But like, you try to change it every time, and every time God came on my side, and that's that. I've been with you for 20 years now. I've served you. Like, I've done all this stuff for you. I am sick and tired of you. And he acknowledges, and you can see it here in verse 42 of 31. He says, if the God of my father, the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac, had not been on my side, surely now I would have sent away from you empty-handed. But God rather saw my affliction. He saw the labor of my hands, and he rebuked you last night. So take that. Laban basically answers and says, okay, let's make a covenant. So they make a covenant. They make a treaty between themselves. They set up a stone as a pillar, and they make these exchanges that I will not come back and mess with you. You don't mess with me. Like, they kind of go their own way. And then it says that Laban arose the next morning, kissed his grandkids and kissed his daughters and blessed them, and went back to his house.
Wow.
So this saga, okay, we're done. We're done with the saga that we've been in. It kind of ends here.
Yeah.
The 20 years that Jacob is in Padan Aram with Laban, his father-in-law, and the drama he has with 2 wives, which become 4 wives, and 7 years, which become 14 years, and limited flocks, which become great flocks, and then wages being changed 10 times. Basically, it's 20 years of life where, partly because you're at fault and partly because other people are at fault, you go through unfair, difficult, painful experiences. And what I want to say to people listening to this and people that are in our church is there's a couple things I want you to be thoughtful about. When you're going through hard things in life, one of our temptations is we want to point at everybody else,
right,
and own nothing for ourselves. And I think that's a fool's errand. We want to tell ourselves a story every day. And if we don't let God enter that story through prayer and refine it and correct it and confront it, we'll have a very errant story. We also are tempted to crumble under the weight that our lives sometimes in certain seasons for 20 years can just feel meaningless. Like I'm just getting up, going to work, drinking a coffee, doing this job, like just trying to survive. And what I'm advocating and encouraging people to think about is this: our lives aren't meaningful because we beckon God to come down and bless my story. Our lives are meaningful because we choose to unfold our lives into God's great story.
Yeah.
And the great story he's telling is about himself, his glory, the goodness of his son who's come to rescue us through the cross and through his resurrection, and that all things are wrapped up in Christ. And this is for the good of the entire cosmos. That God is writing a beautiful story. And if we try to bear the burden of making our own meaning, we will end up exhausted, depressed, and anxious. But if we take our lives and submit them and surrender them to God's story and how he wants to write it and how we're a small plot actor in his great story, then we can be equipped to take our day-to-day mundane, existence, and through prayer and through community and through learning, we can let God's truth shave off the rough edges of our character. We can take our pain and we can be transformed through it. And we can see beauty come from the ashes of our lives. And the warning to all of us is, to the degree we don't do this, we'll either build our own meaning and end up incredibly depressed. Or what we'll do is we'll transfer all of our pain onto those that come after us.
Yeah.
Our kids, our friends, our spouses, our community. And I think this part of the story is a warning and showing us that God is king even of the mundane days of our lives.
So good. Are we at a spot in the story of Jacob where we're going to turn a corner and see more problems? Or are we heading into a few more weeks of starting to hear of the hope in his life?
Hope. It's about to get better. So the next thing that happens is he leaves Padan Aram. He's heading back towards Canaan. His servants his messaging servants go ahead of him, and they run into Esau. And we have one last, just absolutely frightening mess of despair for him. But in the midst of it, he has a night-long wrestling match with God. Jacob is now being invited to come to the end of himself. And that's the only way our beginning with God works. And so he's about to just and he's gonna limp. He's gonna walk with a noticeable limp for the rest of his life. And it's gonna be something that will mark him forever. And it's good. And God allows those things to happen to us. And I think it's God's way of saying, your limp in the temporal is worth the expansion of your faith in the eternal.
It's beautiful. Well, that sounds like a perfect cliffhanger to leave everyone today.
Boom.
You got to tune back in. We got some really good episodes coming in future weeks. Tune in the sermons. That is it for now, and we'll see you next time. Peace.
Sounds good.